Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and there's a story in the news lately about antitrust in Google. I read a very interesting article about it, and I reached out to the author's article, and he was kind enough to agree to come on. He's an adjunct research fellow at AIER, and he has a full-time job at the Cato Institute. Ethan Yang, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what exactly is antitrust, and historically, what has been its purpose?
So antitrust, the name itself is a little confusing, but essentially what it is, some people can call it anti-monopoly law. I prefer the name competition law, but essentially it's a form of law enforcement that's trying to ensure that the marketplace remains competitive and companies don't use unsavory tactics like price fixing, or perhaps a merger is too big to the point where it creates a monopoly. Basically, the premise of the law is to ensure that consumers are protected from the undue use of corporate power. So it's premised on the idea that open markets are good, that competition is good, and that sometimes companies try to use less than competitive means, unsavory tactics to get ahead of one another, and try to extort consumers by creating monopolies. So that is sort of the premise of the law. And I guess the history we can go on and on about, but I'll wrap up by saying that the history, we're at an interesting point today. The reason why antitrust is in the news so much is because it's not supposed to be as aggressive and flashy as it is today. You're not supposed to go through the marketplace breaking up every big tech company you see or every big company you see. Historically, it was actually focused on very specific harms, which usually was related to state government granted monopolies. So you basically using the power of the state and abusing the privileges that the state gave you in order to ensure that other companies don't challenge you. So that is the historic use of it. And now today we're in this age of essentially trying to go after every large company that we see.
So you mentioned consumers, because while I disagree with antitrust laws, I think they're rights violations and I think they're economically counterproductive. Historically, their purpose was to protect consumers from unethical companies that could either corner the market, raise prices, just basically to bilk the consumers. But now that's kind of changed, right? So what is this change in the antitrust approach?
Mhm. So for the past few decades, an antitrust enforcement doctrine has shifted throughout the years, as the debate over economics and what is the right way to interpret economics also goes on. Today, we're in this interesting period where there's a very fashionable idea that yes, of course, the government is the biggest and only monopoly. Yes, of course, that it's always government regulation that is the most permanent distortion in the market. But now there's a fashionable idea that says that perhaps if we broke apart some larger companies, or at least stopped them from doing certain things that perhaps maybe serve consumers, like Amazon's a good example. Amazon has very low prices. Yes, consumers benefit from low prices, but those low prices also stop other competitors from entering the market because they can't compete with Amazon's prices. And so the theory is that if we stopped Amazon from offering such low prices through a variety of different interventions, we can create more Amazons, and then those different Amazons can offer different services and serve consumers, right? So it's this really twisted way of looking at economic competition, saying, yes, of course we love it, but we're going to interfere in the natural competition in the market because because we have a law degree from Yale, an economist that went to MIT, and they agree with us, right? So that's sort of where we are today.
Now there's then this idea that what big companies will do is corner the market, lower their prices. In order to do so, they'll drive everybody else out and then be able to raise their prices. Are there any historical instances that you're aware of that have done that? Like Standard Oil is frequently referred to, but all the studies I've seen have said that Standard Oil never actually gave the vast increase in prices.
Yeah, that's a really romantic notion that everyone likes to point to, and it never actually happens. Primarily because one, keeping prices low and then killing off your competition and then raising them up again. Even if you actually did that, over time, that would just incentivize different competitors to enter the market again. So even if it actually happened, it's going to contradict itself and then fix itself in the end. But even the instance of that happening at all is a fiction. This has actually never happened before. There's actually never been, at least as far as I can tell, and obviously I'm not, I'm not super old, so obviously I haven't been around a while, but I studied antitrust law in law school and did some antitrust stuff professionally. We've never seen this happen before. Most of the time, or all the time, it's a place like Amazon keeps its prices low and they've remained low. There hasn't been an instance where we have not yet reached the point where Amazon has killed off its hypothetical competitors and now they're going to raise their prices and dominate the market forever, right? That just never has happened. And in fact, at least according to American doctrine, until yesterday, right, until things changed so drastically, high prices are actually seen as pro-competitive in the sense that raising prices incentivizes market entry. It tells everyone that, hey, like there's a lot to be gained here, right? So low prices are good, high prices are good. I mean, if you've read any of Mises or any sort of basic economic literature, the price mechanism is a fantastic mechanism in the market. Low, high, middle ground prices, they're all really important and they play a role in the daily functioning of the market. So this obsession with low prices, high prices, like what if they're going to do this or that, I think it's one, it's fairy tales, and two, I think it's ignoring basic economic principles.
Now, in his seminal work, The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith makes a reference to the fact that businessmen, I don't remember the exact quote, but he basically says that businessmen never get together without trying to come up with a means to screw the public. Now, this quote is frequently used in an attempt to make arguments for antitrust laws. How is Adam Smith being misinterpreted here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Adam Smith definitely said a lot of things that perhaps, let's call them the enemies of markets, love to quote out of context, right? Adam Smith was one, not writing normatively. He was just saying what is literally happening. Like if it is human nature to be self-interested, it is human nature, to come together to form a business and maximize your benefit and try to restrain as much as possible what benefits you're giving out to the public. Like that is the basic self-interest, right? And he was observing that. He wasn't saying it's a bad thing. He's just saying that is human nature. What they leave out is the fact that, there's another famous quote that I don't know, Warnick, like I think it's more famous quote actually. He's like, it's not because of the benevolence of the butcher. I'm struggling to find to say the exact quote, but basically said that it's not because the butcher or the brewer or the baker it loves us and that's why they're giving us food. Because they're trying to feed themselves, they're trying to make money. And it's through the advancement of their own self-interests that they make better products than the next person, or they make cheaper products than the next person, right? And they're trying to get ahead of one another and get you to buy their stuff so that at the end of the day, they can take home money. So I think if you're going to say the quote about Adam Smith pointing out how businessmen are greedy and trying their best to, extort the public at their own gain, you also need to read the quote where that same self-interest usually results, especially when there's competition, usually results in them just trying to create better products, create more products, right, to ensure that they can get your money and not the next guy.
Okay, so what is this case against Google, and why is it counterproductive in your view?
Yeah, so the case that I believe you're referencing is the case I used to open up my article is US v. Google. And there are a number of cases called US v. Google because Google's getting sued a lot these days. But the case that I think the case in the news is the case launched by the Trump administration, and I believe 2019 or 2020, and has obviously been continued by the Biden administration because at this point they're all on the same page about it. They're concerned that Google has an agreement with Apple. So if you pull out your iPhone right now and you click the browse button, right? The default browser, the default search browser, like your home page, unless you set it otherwise, is Google search. That was a contract made with Apple, because Apple put out a bid that said like, okay, like who wants to be our default search engine, right? And you can basically highest bidder goes. And also, so Google gave Apple the most money, but also Apple thought about and thought, people like Google. Like, what other search engine do you want to be your default browser? Bing? Not really. DuckDuckGo, I guess, if you're really into privacy. But you have the most popular phone company or phone producer, Apple, and you have the most popular search engine, Google. And they decide to come together and be like, what would really benefit, what would really set us apart, if we have this collaboration where the default search engine is Google, so consumers can just get to it easier, right? So that was the business logic there. The Department of Justice says this is essentially anti-competitive. This agreement basically undercuts the ability of other competitors like Bing or DuckDuckGo, or honestly, like, again, there's just so many search engines I've never heard of and don't care about because they're not very good, right? So DOJ is just thinking, well, if this agreement happens, then consumers will just automatically default to Google, and then they'll never use another company, right? So that was the logic behind this case. And typically cases like these lose because typically courts will just say, well, like, one, they're not creating a monopoly. Two, Google and Apple are two different types of companies. They're not like two oil companies colluding to set prices. It's one company, another company thinking, hey, this agreement, this combo that we're coming up with would be really cool. And so, but recently, the U.S. District Court in D.C. ruled for DOJ. So DOJ won the case, and now we're at the stage where they get to decide what happens. And one of the proposals was we break up Google, which I think is horrifying. And of course, Google is going to appeal this, so it might this might just get overruled. Who knows? That's my hope. But that's where we're at today.
Now, has this operating under the new standard that we talked about, or the new approach where it's not just about competition, have any other high profile cases been brought in recent years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ, it's actually funny. So they actually have I don't know, there's an unwritten agreement that the DOJ gets to have Apple and Google. So anything concerning Apple and Google gets taken care of by DOJ antitrust wise. And the FTC, where I used to work, gets to have Amazon and I believe Microsoft. If it's not, I think Meta, they left them out because I think Meta's not big enough. But anyways, so there's kind of like this agreement between the two that like, hey, there's these four big tech companies that we don't like. And we're going to, since we're all glory hounds and we want to attack them, you guys get those two and we get the other two. So there's already, and basically within the past 4 years, since Biden came into office and essentially set off this new antitrust movement, they've sued all four of them for, I think, objectively outrageous theories of harm that have been rejected by the courts or will be rejected by the courts. So I think I'm rambling on. So I'll name some of them just to wrap up. I think the craziest one is Amazon. So Federal Trade Commission, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, I think people who follow antitrust should know the name, Lina Khan, my former boss, right, wrote an article in law school basically saying we need to break up Amazon. And I know the current law says you can't break up Amazon, but I think, the current law and the current standard is wrong. And so we need to basically have a fundamental change in the way we talk about antitrust and apply, my ideas basically and go after Amazon. And so she launched that lawsuit, I believe last year. I remember I was there. This was when I was there. So it was sort of like this was like the moment, like Lina Khan finally gets her big lawsuit that she's been advocating for since law school. And the whole argument's like, oh, well, like Amazon Prime, the prices are too low. And, in order to get the 2-day delivery guarantee, the companies need to ensure that Amazon gets like its own stock of the produce, its own stock of the products. And this makes it harder for other competitors to offer lower prices or get the same amount of inventory. And it's like this whole weird theory that's caring more about Amazon's potential competitors and not the consumers who ultimately, I think that's what the law is supposed to protect.
Now, you mentioned the Biden administration, and obviously we have an election coming up. Do you have any idea, are there any indications how the two candidates would approach antitrust?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's really Vice President Harris, now, candidate for President Harris, I think is a black box. I don't think anyone really knows what she believes in, quite frankly. The Biden administration, I think President Biden himself, really, I don't even think he had real opinions about antitrust. He just let the progressive legal establishment take care of everything, which I think is exactly what happened. I think he just let Lena Khan be chair of the FTC. And all of a sudden, both the DOJ and the entire Federal Trade Commission are operating under Lena Khan's leadership rather than the Biden administration. So I think it's quite odd. I think the Democrats are in a weird position where they, one, are supposed to be the anti-capitalist, right? They're supposed to be the market skeptical party. But at the same time, a lot of their donors are large tech donors like LinkedIn. For example, the CEO of LinkedIn, I think, is a huge donor to the Harris campaign. And there's recently a big scandal where he said he wants Khan fired if Harris wins, right? And so I think that puts Harris in a really strange position where basically the Biden administration's one of their big hallmarks is antitrust. Like this has become their brand. They have ushered in this new era. And so if firing Lena Khan is essentially rebuking what Biden has started and what the entire progressive establishment has supported. But at the same time, LinkedIn's a mega donor. What do we do there, right? And I'm sure there's many other large tech companies that want the exact same thing and would like to ask Harris to do this, would like to ask Harris to fire Khan as well. So I think my prediction is that I find it difficult for Harris to favor the tech donors over the party platform, the progressive agenda. I feel like that's a really bad look if the first thing she does is fire Khan and then essentially signal to the world that like the Democrats are in favor of big tech companies and big business. Like, I feel like that's just as much as I would like that, I feel like that's just a terrible image, right? So I find that unlikely, but perhaps possible. The Trump administration is, I think Trump is not a fan of Khan. I think Trump does have a general understanding that businesses are good for society and we shouldn't attack them. But the thing is that Trump also doesn't have strong beliefs, and his VP candidate, J.D. Vance, does. And J.D. Vance loves Lena Khan, actually. He's one of the many Republicans in Congress that publicly praise her. J.D. Vance, same thing with Josh Hawley, same thing with Matt Gaetz, right? They're actually on board with Khan, and J.D. Vance has publicly said he would like to keep Khan in office if they were to be elected. So I think the short answer is it could be anyone's guess, and I really do think we're in a weird situation right now where both parties kind of have some soul searching to do about what they're going to do with the FTC if either of them is elected.
Well, that has to do, right, I think, with the rise of populism to a large extent, with the idea that the elites are screwing us, the regular people. And of course, the regular people are anybody who's making the statement. And so it kind of makes sense that they would favor this kind of stuff. But are there any movements out there that have any steam that would get rid of antitrust laws? Is anybody advocating this? I mean, other than think tanks?
Yeah, I think that is sort of the unfortunate reality is that antitrust law, at least like the more intellectual, principled advocacy, tends to be primarily a academic practice. I'm not really sure if there's any sort of more popular groups that are advocating for a return to normalcy or this curtailing of antitrust laws. It's primary. I think we got the initial shift. So antitrust law used to be very interventionist. Then during the Reagan administration, became far more nuanced, and economically driven, and now we're back to the more interventionist stage. And the Reagan administration relied again on people from the University of Chicago's like the whole like there. Maybe there. This is the answer is like there's not going to be a populist or a counter populist movement for more reasonable, if not less antitrust enforcement. But there will be a general pushback against economic intervention and meddling around in the economy in general. And I think that's what got Reagan elected. That's what got Thatcher elected in the UK. And so I think the shift in antitrust doctrine from a very interventionist to a more economically minded and more reasonable standard back in the 80s was more so from a general frustration with the state of the economy, with the state of intervention. The antitrust laws were essentially breaking up like every vertical supply agreement, creating chaos in the economy, right? And so I don't think we're going to have like a popular antitrust group, but we will have a popular agreement that government regulation in general needs to be rolled back. And with that will come, a lot of antitrust scholars and antitrust advocates that can get into the FTC and the DOJ and make the changes that are necessary. But yeah, I guess short answer is I don't think there's going to be a antitrust popular movement per se, but it will come by latching on to a general movement against government regulation.
Wow. So you think there's going to be a movement against regulation? Now Trump claims he was the deregulator in chief, but even he didn't actually cut regulations. He cut the growth of regulation, which is that's what politicians do. They say we cut spending when actually they cut the rate of growth of spending. So it's not an odd thing that he did. It's common to them, but I just like where do you think that such a movement is already boiling up, or do you just think it's going to be the inevitable result of economic malaise?
Unfortunately, I think it's economic malaise. I feel like that's the only time when people really get it, because everyone, I think the popular sentiment is like, we need regulation. The market is chaotic and the government needs to get involved. We need spending because we need to take care of people. Like this is essentially the political culture that has developed over the years. And sometimes you get a break, but those breaks tend to come after a pretty bad time period. Again, Reagan kind of swept in a brief moment where it was Milton Friedman's on TV, talking about how the market is cool, and Hayek's in the White House, right? So there was this moment where you had this cultural appreciation for markets and for deregulation, but that only came after essentially just decades of economic malaise, of the narrative of American decline, of soaring inflation, stagnating economy, right? And so I think people only get it when it becomes really obvious and there's no other way forward. Same thing with the UK. Thatcher, ushers in this cultural wave of markets, but that's only again after there's labor strikes, taking over all the economy. Sometimes there's blackouts, and England's called the sick man of Europe, right? And so I think these movements only happen when things go a little too far, which again is quite depressing, but I do think that's an accurate reading of history.
It
But
is,
what
but
else I will say,
oh, go
uh,
ahead.
I will end by saying for antitrust, though, I do think that the community itself is very frustrated with the way things are going on now. So again, more on the academic front, I do think whichever president is in power is going to get not just like businessmen talking behind their backs, being like, "Oh, please get rid of Khan," but there's actually a lot of people in the community itself, like the academic community that I'm a part of, the practitioners, right, in the law firms, and even at the FTC itself, that are just saying, regardless of what we think about antitrust law, things have gone a little too far. We got to roll it back a little bit.
See, I have no doubt that people will become upset with the economy, but then it would actually require them to diagnose it properly, to understand the cause properly. But in my lifetime, I mean, I was alive when Reagan and Thatcher, but I was three, so I wasn't assessing their economic policies to be sure. But so in my lifetime, people just blame business, or they blame the free market, they blame deregulation. I mean, in 2008, you had a situation where the federal government was putting pressure on banks to loan. The Fed was keeping interest rates low. Fannie and Freddie were buying up mortgages. And yet people still said, oh, it's because of capitalism. That's what's causing this. And that just seems to be the default position, is to blame capitalism, call for more regulation. So why would you think it would be different? I mean, you're younger, I assume, than me. You look younger anyway. So I assume that you maybe know younger people. Are there signs that maybe people will start to get what's really causing the problems?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good caveat that you mentioned, because I do think just thinking that people are going to automatically get it, and sort of like the material forces of the economy will push us to deregulation. That's almost like the way Marx would talk about it, except flipped on its head, is that just things inherently happen because of the material conditions in the economy, and that's neglecting the fact that ideas matter, education matters, history is not set and go any single way depending on who's in charge and what ideas are flowing around. And so I think you're right. We could have a economic reckoning and people can completely misdiagnose it. And I think that's sort of how socialism popped up, really, right? You have a serious economic issues, and then people and then some socialist comes around and says, you know what, I got a solution, and people, went with that, and all of a sudden things got even worse, right? So again, I think we need when the next reckoning comes, and I think it's coming. There needs to be an appropriate infrastructure. There needs to be people at the helm and, popular positions, influential people, right, that are spreading the word saying, things are terrible and here's why, right? And so I think maybe to your ultimate question, is my generation getting it? I'm not actually sure. I think there is. I think there's definitely not an embrace of socialism per se. I don't think people are just saying the economy is not doing so well and it's because of the greedy corporations. I do think people seem to be smarter than that, and there's a general sense that it's not because of just the corporations. The government has something to do with this. But I do think it is an open question of, are we going to see kind of like this Reagan Revolution style where people are watching Milton Friedman on TV? I don't know, right? I hope so. I guess that's what we're trying to do here at Cato and AIER, is to have the people ready when the time is here. But yeah, I do think, again, maybe back to your point, the material conditions of the economy will not inevitably bring about an epiphany about how regulation ought to work. Ideas matter and they need to be fought for.
So I mentioned you seem young. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? If you do, just tell me to go screw
26.
myself. You're 26. Okay.
Yeah.
So what drew you to economics and to the ideas that you're promoting?
hmm Yeah, it's definitely a long story. I guess we can. I think there's two major moments. So the one is just my family upbringing. My mother's ethnically Chinese, but she's from Cambodia, and she was born during the Khmer Rouge regime, which was this
Oof.
awful, highly far left genocidal regime that not only sealed off the entire economy and tried to enact socialism, but then went on a rampaging genocide, right? So from that experience, and I heard the stories as I was growing up. I was born here, but she would always tell me the stories of her childhood. So I think there's always been a part of me that's been inherently skeptical of big government and inherently thinking about, what is the best way to create a prosperous society? Because I guess also growing up in LA, Los Angeles, there's just a lot of homeless people. So I've always just been concerned with, all right, so how do we make people rich, right? How do we get people off the street? How do we get people out of poverty? And so that set me up to be into economics when I got to college. And then I think the next step after that is when I get to college, right? In college, I wasn't, as radically classically liberal / libertarian as I am today. I was more progressive, actually. I didn't believe in socialism, but at least thought like we can have markets, but we need to have a ton of regulations and yada, yada, yada. What got me past that was taking a economics class with Professor Ed Stringham. I'm sure some of your viewers might have heard of him. He's the author of this book called Private Governance. And in his class, we read Hayek, we also read Marx, right? It was this sort of comparing economic systems class. And what the aha moment for me, which then sent me down the path to where I am today, was we looked at this economic freedom in the world index correlation. So what countries are rich, what countries are poor. Let's also look at how free they are. And that graph basically started the, let's call it downward spiral, maybe, of becoming more and more skeptical of government intervention and more in favor of the open market.
Ed Stringham is a professor in economics at Trinity University. I'm from Connecticut. I grew up in Wethersfield, right
Okay.
next door to Harvard. And I was booking for a friend of mine is a talk show host here in Connecticut, very popular talk show host, Todd Feinberg. And I was booking for his show, and I was looking for economics anarchists to get on the show. I'm not an anarchist, but I wanted to, to get the perspective on my friend's show. And Stringham was one of the guys that I found. He actually ended up going on the show, and I actually met Ed Stringham, very nice guy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I went to Trinity College. I guess that's made obvious by your statement. I got my undergrad degree there, and he recruited me to join his think tank AIER right after I graduated. Obviously, he's no longer the president there anymore, but yeah, fantastic dude, super fun to hang around. Throws really cool parties. So I guess I stop myself before I out him and say something embarrassing about him. But yeah, they're
Did
definitely
you
a huge.
did you ever go to the bar across the street from Trinity? I think it's the College View. I we used to go there when I was
Uh,
a teenager.
the bar, was it the
It's on Hillside Avenue. It's across the street from Trinity.
was it called the Tap?
No, it was College View, but they might have changed it. I mean, this is,
Maybe, yeah,
30,
maybe they
30
changed. I
years
know
ago.
there's like I know there's a bar for Trinity students that or caters primarily to Trinity students. I've been there a couple of times. I mean, it's a classic trashy, college bar. Um, sure, yeah, I've been there a couple of times, and but yeah, Stringham's definitely not the type of guy to hang out there. Stringham's definitely more like a drinking martini down in downtown Hartford kind of guy. So I've done that plenty of times with him back in my undergrad days.
Who, and don't say Stringham, outside of Stringham, which classical liberal economist has had the biggest influence on you and why?
Mhm. Yeah, so maybe I'll cheat by giving two answers, but I do think it's pretty integral to the way I think. So
Okay,
if you go to
fine.
my desk at Cato, I have two books on display. On the left, it says Richard Epstein. On the right, it says Deirdre McCloskey. And so Richard Epstein, for those who don't know, is probably one of the leading law professors in the world, not just for libertarians, but law generally. He's a legal giant, and even if you're on the left, you have to respect him. That's how big this guy is.
I've
So
interviewed
he
him a few
really
times.
yeah, yeah.
He's great.
Um, so he really informed more like my policy views. So like what ought to be, like what laws should there be? What are the hard proposals for, designing regulations? So he definitely gave me, because obviously that's all he does is like, if you listen to him, he just spews information, can design basically a new legal system on the back of a napkin. Like this is the type of brilliance that we're talking about. And that's the sort of stuff he focuses on, right? He's a law professor, talks about regulations, very good at it. On the other side is Deirdre McCloskey, perhaps maybe not as notable to some people, but I think very influential nonetheless. And she informs more of like my philosophical, cultural view of economics. So not necessarily what specific regulations there should be, but what is the role of economics? What sort of cultural norms should we have? And that's her whole emphasis, is like her whole book series, Bourgeois Values and Bourgeois Dignity and so on, really talk about the emergence of markets and prosperity as more of a cultural phenomenon rather than a political economic phenomenon, as in economics or the free market system as we see it today is not just property rights and protections for certain economic interests. It's also about attitudes within society. About, when you see someone making money, is your first reaction to be jealous or is your first reaction to applaud it? When people are going out and doing entrepreneurial things, is your first reaction to criticize them for taking risks, or is your first reaction to just mind your own business and let them do it, right? And so these attitudes, according to her thesis, are actually more important than laws, because you can have all the laws you want, you can have the best laws about private property and what have you. If people can use their freedom to hurt one another, to not do anything productive, right? So it's actually like the laws are very important, but what actually makes society go on top of that are attitudes about entrepreneurialness, attitudes about freedom, attitudes about being a productive person, what have you. So, and that she contrasts that from the rest of human history, which is mostly people not taking risks, most people looking to establish institutions like the church and the state to take care of them. And so around the 1600s is actually when we get the outbreak of both markets, as well as these attitudes about how to be an entrepreneur and why that's good.
So, Ethan, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I stay off Twitter or X for obvious reasons. I don't like to argue with people all the time. I just publish stuff all over various outlets, like various media outlets like National Review or Law and Liberty, AI. So I just try to publish wherever it will take me. If you really want to stay in touch with me, LinkedIn, I guess, is where I publish all my stuff. That's the closest you're going to get to being updated. I guess I really should, at this point in my life, start like a Twitter or something so people can actually keep up with me. But if you
It's
want to look
horrible.
me up like Ethan Yang on LinkedIn, it says like Ethan Yang at the Cato Institute. That's where you can actually see like my day-to-day publications. And then I guess also just if you follow Law and Liberty or you follow National Review or you follow the various, outlets that publish things, I try my best to publish as frequently as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Ethan. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thanks so much for having me.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Until next time.